The night lay still over Stu Winter's land, a heavy, unmoving blanket of heat and silence. The soil still breathed out the day's warmth, carrying with it the faint, sweet scent of sun-baked earth mingled with the damp tang of the irrigation ditch beyond the fields. Above, the moon hung low and fat, silvering the rows of vegetables that stretched into the distance. Stu sat in his usual place, the porch chair that groaned under his weight, the old bolt-action rifle balanced across his knees. Sleep hadn't come easy in years. Not since the war. He sipped bitter coffee gone lukewarm, eyes scanning the garden, out of habit more than suspicion. The hum of insects droned in the background, joined by the occasional rustle of leaves when the breeze slipped past. Then, from the corner of his vision, something shifted. It wasn't the careless sway of a branch or the clumsy shuffle of a raccoon. No, this movement had intention in it. Fluid, deliberate, too precise for any animal that belonged here. Stu's spine stiffened, his hand tightening on the rifle. Slowly, silently, he rose to his feet, boots pressing into the porch planks without a sound. The garden rose glowed faintly in the moonlight as he stepped off the porch, moving with the same practiced stealth that had kept him alive in darker places than this. The figure froze mid-step, caught between two rows of ripe tomatoes, her posture low, cautious. She turned toward him, and for a moment his breath stalled. She was tall, lean, her dark hair falling down her back in a shimmering curtain that caught the moonlight like strands of ink. Her skin, a deep, muted blue, glowed faintly under the pale silver wash, smooth and unmarked except for the faint hollows of her cheeks. In her arms, clutched to her chest with the kind of desperation he recognized from too many refugee camps, was a bundle of vegetables, still dripping dirt from their roots. Her bare feet shifted in the soil, and he saw the tremor in her hands. She didn't speak, just stared at him, eyes wide and unblinking. Not fear, exactly, something sharper. Desperation sharpened into readiness. Stu kept the rifle steady, though not raised. "You planning on explaining yourself?" he said, voice low and rough from disuse. "Or should I just start shooting?" Her lips parted, the words catching in her throat, before emerging in a voice that was accented but clear enough to understand. "Please, my children are hungry." The words hit harder than he expected. He might have told her to go. Should have. But a faint sound behind her made him pause. A small shape moved in the shadows near the tree line, then another. Two tiny figures stepped hesitantly into the moonlight. Children, their blue skin paler than hers, streaked with dirt. Their eyes, wide and luminous like polished stone, fixed on him with the wariness of creatures that had learned to fear strangers early. The taller, a girl, clung to the smaller boy protectively. He looked thin, fragile in a way that turned Stu's stomach. The boy took a halting step forward, his gaze flickering between Stu and the woman. Then, slowly, as if the act itself carried more weight than he could bear, he reached into the bundle his mother held. His small hand emerged, holding a bruised tomato. He stepped closer, arm outstretched, offering it to Stu with a solemnity that made the world feel too quiet. A peace offering. A child's attempt to bargain with a man who hadn't yet given them a reason to trust him. Stu stared at the tomato, then at the boy's thin face. He felt something twist deep in his chest, kind of ache that had nothing to do with age or injury. He exhaled, rubbed a hand down his face, and muttered a curse under his breath. "Come inside," he said finally. The woman stiffened, eyes darting to the house and back to him, searching for the trap. "You deaf?" Stu added, turning toward the porch. "Ain't gonna make those kids sleep in the dirt." After a heartbeat that stretched too long, she followed. The children stayed close to her legs, their small hands gripping her tattered clothing. Stu opened the screen door and stepped aside. And just like that, he let a blue-skinned alien woman and her starving children into his home, knowing he'd probably regret it, but more certain he'd regret it if he didn't. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the soft yellow glow of the overhead lamp that hummed faintly, the bulb flickering once before steadying. The air inside carried the lingering aroma of old coffee and the faint, woody scent of worn floorboards. Stu leaned his rifle in the corner and stood by the counter, arms crossed, watching the woman hover near the doorway, as if stepping too far inside might trigger some hidden snare. The children clung to her legs, their wide eyes darting between Stu and their mother. Neither spoke. He wasn't sure what the hell he was doing, letting strangers, alien strangers, into his home. He barely tolerated most people on a good day, and yet, there they were. He pulled open a cabinet and started gathering what he had. A half-loaf of bread, a few apples, the pot of stew from the night before. Nothing fancy, but food was food. He set it on the table and nodded toward it. Sit. The woman hesitated, glancing at the children, then guided them to the chairs. It perched on the edges, like they might spring away at the first wrong move. She stayed standing until he gave her a sharper look. She sat, but her posture stayed tight, ready to move. You waiting for an invitation? He asked. Her gaze flickered between him and the bread before she reached for it, not for herself, but to tear off a piece and pass it to each child. Only then did she take one for herself. They ate with a slow, deliberate restraint, chewing carefully, as though afraid it might vanish before they finished. The boy spoke first, voice small and hesitant. This is good. Stu blinked. He hadn't expected any of them to speak so soon. It's just stew, he said, settling into the chair across from them. Ain't anything special. The boy looked down at his bowl, then back up at him. It's warm. Something in that simple observation landed heavier than it should have. Stu swallowed, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. Well, he muttered, ain't much point in eating if it ain't warm. The boy smiled faintly, and Stu caught a flash of what he might look like if he didn't carry so much in those small shoulders. The girl, though, stayed quiet, watching him with sharp, measuring eyes. Under the better light, he could see more of their mother. Ree, she'd said her name was Ree when he asked, looked less wild than she had in the garden, though there was still a coiled readiness in her. The lines at the corners of her eyes spoke of long days without rest. You want to tell me what the hell you're doing stealing from my garden in the middle of the night? He asked finally. She set the bread down, fingers tightening slightly. We were looking for food, she said. A pause. And hiding. Hiding from what? Her gaze dropped to the table. We escaped. There were others. We got separated. Her voice stayed even, but there was an emptiness under it that made his jaw tighten. The girl spoke up then, her tone steady, but far too serious for her age. Mama says we have to be careful. She's right, Stu said. The girl didn't blink. Are you going to tell them we're here? He didn't need to ask who them was. He shook his head. I ain't the reporting type. She studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. The boy, quieter now, tilted his head. Are you a soldier? The question stopped him cold. It had been years since anyone called him that. Not anymore, he said after a moment. The boy seemed to consider this, then tore off a piece of his bread and held it out to Stu. What are you doing? Stu asked. Sharing, the boy said simply. Ree didn't stop him, only watched. Stu hesitated, then took it. It was a small thing, but it landed heavier than he'd ever admit. He cleared his throat. Come on, he said gruffly. You can't. Sleep at the table. Got a spare room. It ain't much, but it's got blankets and a door that locks. The children's eyes lit at the word blankets, and Ree's gaze softened almost imperceptibly. She followed him down the hall, the kid's small hands clutching her clothes. The room was plain. A single bed, an old dresser, a lamp that flickered. If the wind hit the wires wrong, but when they stepped inside, Ree let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing for the first time. The kids scrambled onto the bed, curling into the blankets like they'd found something rare. "It locks from the inside," Stu said. Ree met his gaze. "Thank you," she murmured. He grunted and stepped away. The house settled back into its quiet, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel entirely empty. The morning broke soft and pale, the mist still clinging low over the rows of vegetables like the earth was reluctant to let go of its dreams. The air was cool yet heavy with the promise of heat to come, and the sky glowed faintly gold where the sun pushed up over the horizon. Stu stood at the stove, the hiss of eggs in the pan mingling with the faint creak of the old house as it woke. He'd been up since before dawn, moving through his chores with the restless energy that always came after a night with company under his roof. Company. He still wasn't sure why he'd let them stay, and yet the idea of sending them back out into the dark sat like a stone. In his gut, the sound of light footsteps behind him made him glance over his shoulder. Ree stood in the doorway, her dark hair a tangle from sleep, her clothes wrinkled but cleaner than last night. She held herself like a guest in hostile territory. Spine straight, shoulders tight, eyes scanning the kitchen before settling on him. "Coffee's hot," he said, jerking his chin toward the pot. She stepped forward cautiously, fingers curling around the mug he slid across the table. The steam curled upward into her face, and she breathed it in before taking a tentative sip. The grimace she made after was small, but he caught it. "That is terrible," she muttered. He smirked. "Don't drink it then." But she didn't set the mug down. A second set of footsteps came padding into the kitchen. The boy appeared first, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his small bare feet silent on the wood floor. His sister trailed behind, more deliberate, her gaze sweeping the room before she joined him. "You sleep all right?" Stu asked. The boy nodded. "The blankets smelled nice." Stu arched a brow. "Told you they were clean." The boy hummed in agreement, then peered toward the stove. "What's that?" "Eggs," he blinked. "What's eggs?" Stu frowned, then glanced at Ree. She lowered her eyes. "Food was limited," she said quietly. He didn't press for details, just cracked another egg into the pan. A few minutes later, he set plates on the table, sliding one in front of each kid and one to Ree. The boy stared at his food for a moment, then looked up at him. "Are you sure?" "Why wouldn't I be?" Stu asked. The boy glanced at his mother. She gave a small nod, and only then did he take a bite. His eyes widened. "This is so good," Stu snorted. "Told you." The girl ate with more restraint, but he saw the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. Ree only picked at her plate, though she kept glancing at the children as they ate like they were soaking in something rare. When the plates were mostly empty, Stu leaned back in his chair. "You really think you can keep running forever?" Ree set her fork down. "We don't have a choice. Everybody's got a choice." "Not us," she said, voice low but firm. The boy looked up then, his voice small. "Are we safe here?" Stu's gaze flicked to Ree, then back to him. "For now," he said. The boy nodded as if that were enough, but the girl kept her eyes on Stu, as though weighing whether he was telling the truth. When breakfast was cleared, Stu stood, grabbed his hat, and headed for the door. "Come on," he said over his shoulder. "You said you wanted to help." Ree hesitated in the kitchen doorway, the children flanking her. But after a moment, she stepped outside into the morning light, following him toward the fields. The rows stretched out before them, green and gold under the rising sun. Stu knelt and pulled a weed from the base of a tomato plant, holding it up. These choke the roots if you don't get 'em out. Grab 'em by the base, or they'll grow back. She crouched beside him, mimicked his grip, and yanked the weed. Free. He gave a short nod. Not bad. A flash of movement caught his eye, and he looked up to see the boy bounding toward them, his sister following more slowly. "What are you doing?" The boy asked. "Helping," Ree said. The boy puffed his chest. "Can I help too?" Stu smirked. "Might as well put you to work." Within minutes, all four of them were on their knees in the soil, the morning sun warming their backs. The boy chattered while he worked. The girl stayed silent, and Ree moved with a focused determination that reminded Stu of someone used to working for survival. When they finally stopped, the boy held up a stubborn weed he'd managed to yank free, grinning with pride. Stu gave him an approving nod. For a moment, under that sun, with dirt on their hands and the smell of earth all around, it almost felt like they belonged there. The day wore itself thin in slow, steady strokes of heat. By late afternoon, the air over the fields shimmered, and the breeze that sometimes cut across the land had gone still. Stu worked the last row of the west field, sweat soaking into the back of his shirt, the brim of his hat shielding his eyes. From the low, molten glare of the sun, from the porch, he could feel eyes on him. He didn't have to look to know who they belonged to. When he finally straightened, stretching the ache from his back, his gaze flicked toward the house. Ree stood in the shadow of the open doorway, hands curling loosely at her sides, her posture hesitant. She stepped out slowly, the sun catching on her hair as she crossed the dirt between them. The set of her shoulders was stiff, but there was no wariness in her eyes, just a quiet decision. She stopped a few paces from him, letting her gaze wander over the rows of crops, the way the plants bowed gently under their own weight. "I want to help again tomorrow," she said. Stu pushed his hat back a little, studying her. "You don't have to." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not about having to. I can't just sit. Feels wrong." He understood that, though he didn't say it. Instead, he nodded toward the porch. "Fine, but in the morning. This heat'll cook you alive." A small twitch of her mouth might have been the ghost of a smile, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She looked toward the far line of trees, her expression shifting, as if a thought had come uninvited. "We never stayed anywhere long," she said quietly. "Couldn't. Every place, no matter how hidden, someone would come. Always." Stu leaned against the fence, arms crossed. "You keep saying you're hiding. Who from?" Her eyes stayed on the horizon, her voice steady but thinner now. "People who don't believe we should exist." He felt his jaw tighten. "Government? Not just them." She shifted her weight, like her own skin had grown too tight. "I was taken once. There were others. Some had been caught before me, some born in captivity. We weren't soldiers. We weren't criminals, but we were kept, used." Her voice didn't waver, but it was stripped of anything human warmth. "I escaped, but they don't stop looking. And if they find me, they find my children." The silence between them thickened, the air suddenly heavier than the heat could account for. Stu's gaze drifted toward the tree line without meaning to, the old instinct stirring in the back of his mind. "They ever come this far out?" He asked. "Not often," she said, "but I don't take chances." He let out a slow breath, pushing away from the fence. "So what you're telling me is, sooner or later, someone's going to come looking." Her silence was answer enough. He stared at her for a long moment, then back toward the fields that had been his entire world for years. "How long you planning on running?" "As long as I have to. That ain't much of a plan. It's the only one I've had." He studied her, the sharp line of her jaw, the exhaustion in her shoulders, the way she carried both defiance and dread like twin weights. Then, with a certainty that surprised even him, he said, "Maybe it's time for a new one." She turned toward him, brows knitting. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I've got land, walls, and I know how to defend both." His voice was steady, unshaken. "I ain't a man who believes in running." Something flickered in her eyes, doubt, maybe, or the fragile start of belief. She searched his face, and whatever she found there made her inhale slowly, as though she'd been holding her breath for too long. The heat was finally breaking. A faint wind moved through the stalks of corn, carrying the scent of dry grass. Stu tipped his hat back into place and glanced toward the porch. "Storm's coming," he muttered. He wasn't talking about the weather. The storm didn't arrive in a flash. It crept out by nightfall. The air had gone heavy, thick enough that every breath felt like work. The crickets had gone quiet, the wind too, as if the land itself was waiting for something. Stu sat on the porch with his rifle propped against the railing, eyes fixed on the black seam of the tree line. He'd been feeling it for hours, the prickling along his neck, the way the silence pressed on his ears. Behind him, the screen door creaked. Ree stepped out, her presence quiet but sharp. She didn't linger in the doorway this time. She crossed to stand beside him, her gaze following his. "They're asleep," she said. He nodded without looking at her. "Good. Keep him that way." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You felt it too." "Yeah?" The wind shifted, rustling the crops just enough to mask another sound. A footstep too steady to be an animal. Stu's fingers curled around the rifle. And then, faint but unmistakable, a flash of light between the trees. Not lightning. Not natural. Ree's voice was barely above a whisper. "They found us." He didn't ask how she knew. He just moved. "Get the kids," he said, already on his feet. She was gone in an instant, silent down the hall. Stu crossed to the back of the kitchen, dragging open a drawer to pull out the old 12-gauge. He checked the chamber, shoved extra shells into his pocket, and grabbed the flashlight. Small footsteps padded into the kitchen. The boy stood there, bare feet on the cool floor, shirt hanging off his thin frame. "Are we leaving?" he asked. Voice small. Ry came in behind him, the girl clinging to her hand. "No," she said firmly. Stu's eyes met hers. "You sure?" She gave one short nod. He glanced at the kids. "There's a crawl space under the kitchen floor. If I say so, you get in and don't come out till you hear my voice. Clear?" The girl nodded once. The boy swallowed and mirrored her. A sharp crack split the air, a branch snapping under weight. Stu moved to the front window and killed the lights. Another sound. Slow, deliberate footfalls. "They're not just passing through," Ree murmured. "No." Stu agreed. Figures began to materialize in the dark, 4 of them, moving like they knew exactly what they were doing. Dressed in black, faces shadowed, weapons in hand. Stu stepped onto the porch, rifle raised. "You're trespassing," he called out. One of the men stepped forward, just enough for the moon to find him. Lean, deliberate, eyes cold. "Didn't mean to spook you, friend," he said in a voice that carried an ugly sort of calm. "Just looking for someone." "Ain't nobody out here but me," Stu replied, leveling the rifle. The man tilted his head, almost smiling. "That so?" The others began to fan out. Stu's finger tightened on the trigger. "You've got 5 seconds to walk away." The man sighed, as though disappointed. "Shame. I was hoping we could be civil about this." Then he moved. Stu fired first. The shot thundered through the night, scattering the men. Return fire snapped past him, splinters leaping from the porch rail. He dropped behind cover, reloaded, and sent another blast into the dark. One of the shadows crumpled with a grunt. Movement at the corner of his vision. Someone flanking. Stu swung toward it, just as Ree appeared in the doorway, a knife glinting. In her hand, she didn't hesitate. She disappeared into the dark, and a second later, a strangled cry cut through the gunfire. When she re-emerged, there was blood on her hands and none of it hers. The remaining men faltered. Stu took the opening, his next shot dropping another. The last turned and ran for the trees, vanishing into the black. The quiet that followed was sudden, jarring. The only sound was the wind returning, whispering through the stalks. Stu lowered the rifle and met Ree's gaze. Her chest rose and fell, evenly, the blade still in her grip. "This ain't over," he said. Her eyes were dark, steady. "No," she agreed. "It's not." By the time the first streaks of daylight touched the fields, the work was done. They'd buried the bodies. At the far edge of the property, where the soil was stony and the weeds grew thick. No markers, no names. Just shallow mounds pressed flat under the weight of shovelfuls of cold dirt. Stu's shoulders ached, his hands raw beneath the gloves, but it wasn't the kind of pain that lingered in the muscles. It was the kind that sat deep where memory lived. Ree had worked beside him in silence, her face unreadable, movements precise. She didn't shy from the work, didn't flinch from the sound of dirt hitting flesh. When the last mound was level, she straightened, wiped her hands on her trousers, and turned back toward the house without a word. Now Stu sat on the porch steps, cigarette rolling unlit between his fingers. The dawn mist was already starting to burn off, the light bleeding gold across the fields. It could have been any other morning, if not for the dark, wet patches in the earth beyond the fence. The screen door creaked open behind him. Ree stepped out, the knife from last night nowhere in sight, but her posture still strung tight as wire. She came down the steps until she stood beside him, arms folded. "They'll send more," she said finally. Stu nodded. "Yeah." She shifted, her weight looking out toward the horizon. "We should leave." He turned his head toward her. "You still think running's gonna save you?" Her gaze slid to the side. "It's kept us alive this long. And how's that worked out for you?" Her jaw tightened, but she didn't answer. The door creaked again, this time softer. Two pairs of small feet shuffled forward. The boy came first, hair sticking up in every direction, his sister close behind. Both were still in the oversized clothes he'd found for them. The boy blinked at them blearily. "Are we going somewhere?" Ree hesitated, opening her mouth, but Stu spoke before she could. "No," he said. The boy frowned. "But the bad men, they're gone," Stu said. "For how long?" The girl asked, her tone sharper. "As long as we make it," Stu replied, his voice steady as stone. The girl studied him for a moment, then gave the faintest nod. The boy seemed satisfied with that answer, and without another word, he lowered himself to sit beside Stu on the step. A moment later, his sister joined him, their small shoulders pressed together. Ree's eyes moved between Stu and her children, some emotion flickering there that she didn't quite let reach her face. She sat on the porch railing, her knees drawn, slightly in. They stayed like that for a while, the four of them, watching the light stretch across the land. Somewhere beyond the horizon, trouble would come again. Stu knew it, and so did Ree, but the quiet held for now. The wind carried the scent of earth. The stalks swayed lazily, and the laughter of children, faint but real, drifted from the steps. For the first time since they'd walked onto his land, Stu felt it. They weren't just staying here. They belonged. Here, the heat of the day had slipped into something gentler, the sky painted in streaks of amber and rose as the sun sank behind the far hills. The worst of the summer glare had faded, leaving the fields bathed in a warm, forgiving light. Stu stood by the fence, one hand resting on the rough wood, the other cradling a chipped mug of coffee gone lukewarm. In the yard, the kids darted through the grass, their laughter carrying on the evening air. The boy's bare feet slapped the dirt as he tried to tag his sister, who shrieked in mock outrage and swerved around him. Their movements were unburdened, lighter than they'd been since the night he found them in his garden. It was the kind of sound his land hadn't heard in years. Ree stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching them with a softness she didn't bother to hide. She stepped down slowly, her boots crunching over the gravel as she came to stand beside him. "They're happy," she said quietly. "Looks that way." She shifted, leaning against the fence rail. "I don't know what comes next." Stu glanced at her. "Planning on running again?" Her eyes stayed on the children. "Not this time." The words were simple, but there was weight in them. A choice she'd probably never made before. He nodded once. The quiet between them not awkward but solid, something you could build on. Her hand rested on the fence close to his, fingers brushing the weathered wood. He let his own slide, just far enough that his knuckles grazed hers. She didn't pull away. "You're not the only one who's been keeping things close," she said after a long moment. He raised an eyebrow. "That right?" Ree's gaze moved to the horizon, her voice lower now, deliberate. "The men who came, they weren't just after me. They were after what I'm carrying." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Carrying?" She turned to face him. Fully, and for the first time since they met, there was no guard in her expression, only resolve. "Before I escaped, I took something. A data core. Small, but valuable enough for them to kill anyone in their way. It's hidden inside." "E?" The wind slipped across the fields, stirring the crops in a slow ripple. Stu didn't speak, waiting. "It's proof," she went on. "Evidence of the experiments. The ones that made hybrids part human, part my kind. They wanted weapons. Instead, they got children." Her eyes flicked toward the yard. "The kids were chasing fireflies now, oblivious. Mine are the only ones left." The weight of that settled between them like another presence. Stu's jaw flexed. He looked from her to the children, then back again. "So if they find you, they find them. And if they get that core, they'll make more." He let the silence stretch, his gaze sweeping the land, the fence line, the far tree line where the shadows were gathering again. Finally, he exhaled through his nose. "Guess we'll just have to keep the place ready for company." A faint, almost disbelieving smile touched her lips. The kids came running back toward them. Fireflies trapped between cupped hands, their faces lit from within by the soft glow. Ree reached down to smooth the boy's hair, the girl pressing close to her side. Stu looked at them, at her, at the land that had been his for so long. And for the first time in years, he didn't just see a place to be alone. He saw something worth defending. Night fell slow and warm around them, the stars pricking through the dark one by one. Stu took his usual seat on the porch, rifle across his lap, listening to the sound of the children inside and the faint creak of the floorboards under Ree's steps. The world beyond the fence would come for them again. And when it did, it wouldn't find them running.